Thank you all for being here and for coming together on what I hope will be the first of the nation's best series of remembrances and commemorations of one of the great Americans we've known. Others who will follow me here and others who will follow during the year ahead will reminisce and analyze the accomplishments, the achievements, the history that Ronald Reagan made. I think I'll spend only a moment on that. My thoughts as I looked ahead to this morning were more about Reagan the person, who I was privileged to see in close proximity for several years. I saw people, whether they knew him well or were close around him, always affected the same. It was a mix of awe, inspiration, pride. But you know, when I think about our 40th president, for me it always starts with a smile. There was a humor about the man that was at the essence of who he was, but was also very essential to the president he became. I mean, he loved a good laugh for its own sake. He'd say things in front of a convention of economists. He said, an economist is someone who sees something work in practice and wonders if it works in theory. He said that after some experience in it, he said, politics has been described as the second oldest profession, but it bears a striking resemblance to the first. There was a part of his likability, and his likability was a huge part of his success in multiple careers. He succeeded in 6 careers, after all, when you count them all: acting, union leader, corporate spokesman, governor, president, and on and on. But to me, there was a serenity about the man, and he was self-confident enough that he could shrug off sometimes very harsh and harmful, hateful things even said about him, very critical things, never seemed to bother him. And in fact, nobody was better at poking fun at Ronald Reagan than Ronald Reagan. It's a very endearing thing. I'm sure many people here remember. So people would say, he's too old. He'd tell the next audience, oh, here I've been down at the White House burning the midday oil. Or in '85, I remember Halley's Comet came around on its 80-some year cycle. Reagan got up on the night it was going by and said, I don't really get the big deal about Halley's Comet. I caught it the last 3 times, and it's really not so much. Or maybe one of my favorites, it was alleged he wasn't paying enough attention always to duty, and he told the next crowd he got in front of, I've left explicit instructions to be awakened in the event of a national emergency, even if it's during a cabinet meeting. He knew how to use humor to make a point, though. He could distill sometimes into one funny line a very, very serious point that somebody else might have taken a half-hour speech to deliver. Some of you will have your favorites. I mean, he said, when you get in bed with the federal government, you get a whole lot more than a good night's sleep. He said things like, a taxpayer is someone who works for the federal government, doesn't have to take the civil service exam. One of his best little epigrams, I always thought, was he summed up the entirety of his critique of the federal government of his day, I thought, in one sentence. He said, the policy of this government is, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. When it stops moving, subsidize it. That's all he had to say. I think about Reagan the man and the way he changed the office of president, or in some ways maybe reaffirmed it, and left it in better shape. Others of my generation may remember there was a time in the 60s and 70s when people began to say things like, maybe that job's too big for one person. Seriously, I mean, people actually suggested maybe we need sort of at least a 2-headed president. There's just too much. Some of our presidents almost, I thought, reveled in the anguish of the job. It's just such a crushing burden, and their brow was always furrowed, and their face was always frowning, and you could see the weight of the world on them. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that it doesn't rest there. But Ronald Reagan did it the other way around. I can tell you this truthfully. He made a point of making the job look easier than it was. For instance, he made all kinds of jokes, as I said, about not working hard. But let me tell you, he was working much harder than he wanted anybody to know. There was at 4 o'clock every day, if you had a document the president needed to see, that was the deadline, late in the day. And you had to turn it into the appropriate office, where they'd collate all this and get it to him. And I can't imagine what a mountain it must have been most days. It was always back on your desk the next morning with his instruction or some comment in the margin. But he didn't want anybody to know it. He enjoyed the job, and he let it show. Ronald Reagan was a second-person politician. I've always thought you could learn a lot watching people in public life, just listening to them. The ones that set me back the most are the ones who talk about themselves in the third person, use their own name as though they were somebody else. Never. Next to that are the first-person politicians, where everything is I this and I that, and all about them. Ronald Reagan almost never used the pronoun, very, very rarely. It's always about you, the American people, what you are capable of, what the kind of people you are and must be if we're going to be a great nation. Occasionally it was we. It was never about I. And when you listen to that, it reminded you to expect more of yourself, to be a fuller citizen, and that the real responsibility in a free society is not for the government to do for us and direct us and protect us from our own misjudgments, but to encourage us and assist us and facilitate our own best use of our God-given potential. Ronald Reagan was often characterized as an anti-government politician, but he never saw it that way. In fact, he said very, very specifically on many occasions, "We are not here to destroy government, but to put it on your side." There's a very important distinction. He never let skepticism about big government become contempt for all government, because he intended to build a government that would work for the American people and solve some incredibly large problems that he faced. I said I would leave any discussion of his monumental achievements to this rest of this occasion and to the year ahead, but summing it up as the president himself was so good at. Clare Boothe Luce, the famous author, said to him one time, "Mr. President, every president gets one sentence in history, and yours will be, he won the Cold War without firing a shot." A pretty profound comment. But I've always thought that Ronald Reagan was that very, very rare exception. He was a two-sentence president at least. I would submit that in addition to his conquest, his success in leading freedom in the standoff against totalitarianism, it can also be said of Ronald Reagan that he restored the American economy and the American spirit. Two-sentence president, either one of which would mark him as one of the greats in our history. If he were with us today, he would accept no credit for this. He would, as he always did, speak in the second person. He would give all the credit to you, the American people. He had an abiding faith in the American people. In days darker than even those we've been through recently, he never ever lost confidence that Americans still had the stuff of liberty in them, the ability to do what was necessary to govern ourselves. And I rummaged around and found one of the many speeches of his that I held on to. which I think speaks to it, and I'll leave you with it. He finished a speech back in the 80s by reading from the ending of a play that he loved, Benjamin Franklin in Paris. And the playwright, dramatizing, of course, but I think rendering Franklin truthfully, has in the final act of the play, Franklin is sitting alone in Paris, and he's imagining if he could come back 200 years later to this land of freedom that was just being born. And Reagan loved these words. Franklin says to himself, what a dream, 200 years. And I wonder, how should I find them then? Those Americans to whom the name American will not be new. Will they love liberty, being given it in the crib for nothing? Will they know that if you are not free, you are sir lost without hope? Will they be willing to strive to preserve these ideas as we so willingly strove to plant them, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights? Franklin was talking about us. Reagan finished, I think old Ben, were he able to make such a visit, might be a little proud of what he would find, and he might even have a word or two of praise for what we and the American people have achieved together. But because he was always a wise man, Franklin would also remind us how fragile are the accomplishments of the recent past, and how it is up to every generation to relight in its own time the lamp of freedom. Well, a generation has passed since our 40th president led us to win the Cold War without firing a shot, to rebuild the American economy, and with it, the morale that led Americans to say to themselves in complete sincerity, it's morning again in America. And so, again, a next generation must see if we have the stuff that he drew out of us, always believed we had, in times of very serious difficulty, a new set of threats. It's our turn to relight the lamp of freedom. There's no better way we can honor Ronald Reagan this next year than to take heed of those words and step up to that task. Thank you all so much for being here.